Can the Baltimore Ravens follow the blueprint of the Kansas City Chiefs to win themselves a Super Bowl? We talk about that. The latest on Eric Bieniemy, Brian Johnson, and the Ravens offensive coordinator search, Calais Campbell's return, and much, much more coming up next here on this episode of Locked On Ravens.
You are Locked On Ravens, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another edition of the Locked On Ravens podcast, your daily Baltimore Ravens podcast. I'm your host, Kevin Ostrecker of Ravens Wire, and we are here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thank you so much for being here with us today and tuning in, making us your first listen of the day. We're free and available on all podcasting platforms. That includes over on YouTube in video form. And today's episode of Locked On Ravens is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's not a crisis line. It's not self-help. It's professional therapy done securely online, available to people worldwide. And they have a special offer for listeners. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. And we are back here after Super Bowl Sunday. The Kansas City Chiefs are the newest Super Bowl champions. And I say that even after they won a Super Bowl a couple of years ago, but they defeat the Philadelphia Eagles 38-35. It was a really good game. I thought the halftime show was great. Rihanna, I thought, did a great job, although I'll always be partial to the Beyonce 2013 Ravens 49ers one that I went to. So that's that. But still, great football game. Patrick Mahomes gets his second Super Bowl championship. You have Orlando Brown Jr. and Brandon Williams, so some former Ravens getting their first Super Bowl ring with the Chiefs. And we're going to talk a lot about just the Kansas City blueprint and if the Ravens can take that and adapt it and win a Super Bowl themselves. And we'll talk about kind of how it contrasts and compares to the Eagles blueprint and how both teams got there and what the Ravens can do to kind of bolster their roster and even their coaching staff to want to maybe adapt what the Chiefs did or what the Eagles did. So we'll do that in the first segment. And the second segment, we'll dive a little bit more into the offensive coordinator search, some decently big news and reports dropped over the weekend about Eric Bieniemy and Brian Johnson, who was a new official name into that candidacy. So we'll talk about that in the second segment. And then in the final segment, we'll talk about Calais Campbell announcing he's returning for his 16th season. We'll talk about the impact of that, whether his 16th season will be in Baltimore, and a lot more. So a ton to dive into as usual today on Locked On Ravens. And we have a lot to dive into every day. It's another weekday, which means it's another Locked On Ravens episode 5 days a week, even in the offseason. During the offseason, we are active 5 days a week. We never stop going here Monday through Friday on Locked On Ravens. So if you do want daily Ravens content, Ravens news, analysis, updates, and so much more, be sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube and like the video. And also, we are in audio form. A big part of what we do is an audio form. It's the same show, both audio and video, but if you like our content, you can find us anywhere you get your podcasts in audio form. So thank you all for the support and everything. It's been great doing this, and we are now entering full off-season mode as the Super Bowl's over. And off-season is fun. We get free agency, we get the draft, OTAs, training camp. So a lot of content to come on Locked On Ravens. So let's now talk about this Kansas City blueprint. Again, Kansas City they've been one of the top premier teams in this league ever since Patrick Mahomes took over as the starter. I think they maximized his rookie contract very well, surrounding him with weapons. Obviously, Tyreek Hill in that equation, Travis Kelce are the big two. But then you have guys kind of going in and out of that rotation. I mean, for as not great as Sammy Watkins and his tenure went in Baltimore, he was solid for a couple years there. Demarcus Robinson played a role on those Kansas City offenses. And again, those aren't like top premier number two options, right? You look at Tyreek Hill, you're like, yeah, that's a number one. That's a pure number one guy. But then where are the other options? But the Chiefs in particular, what the compare and contrast what the Eagles did compared to what the Chiefs did is the Eagles on offense. The defense, the Eagles kind of brought guys in and they traded for a lot of guys. They signed a lot of guys. Outside of A.J. Brown, if I'm not mistaken, the Eagles' offense was entirely homegrown, where, Jalen Hurts and Miles Sanders and Lane Johnson and Devonta Smith and all these players were homegrown. Dallas Goedert, right? The only guy that they traded for was A.J. Brown. And I think when you look at the Ravens, not their entire offense isn't homegrown. I mean, I think a lot of it is right now, right? I mean, you look at Lamar Jackson, assuming he comes back, J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards, and Mark Andrews. But then you have the Kevin Zeitlers, who was signed over in free agency, and you have the Morgan Moses, who was signed over in free agency, and a couple other guys here and there. But at the same time, on the defensive side of the ball, as I mentioned, for the Eagles, they brought in some guys. The Chiefs have brought in some guys there too. They traded for Frank Clark. Chris Jones was a homegrown guy, but they signed Justin Reed and a couple of players there. So on offense, the Chiefs, it's a lot of homegrown guys there too. I mean, Mahomes and Pacheco and Travis Kelce. But you look at what they did wide receiver wise when they let Tyreek Hill go. It was not going out there and trading for another star number one. It was signing Juju Smith-Schuster to a one-year deal. Marquez Valdes-Scantling, they traded for Kadarius Toney. So what I think the Ravens can do here, and their offensive line, yes, they signed Joe Thuney. They traded for Orlando Brown. So when you look at the Ravens offense, I think it is more tailored towards more homegrown talent as opposed to what the Chiefs did. But it's not all homegrown talent on the starter level. It's a couple of guys who were traded for or signed for, but you still have your homegrown. So what I think the Ravens could do and maybe adapt both what Kansas City and what Philadelphia did is if they trade for either a number one guy or bring in borderline two, maybe even like a borderline one option in free agency and sign two of those guys. But they can't be like, I'm not talking Michael Crabtree. I'm not talking Jeremy Maclin. They have to be better than that. They have to be Juju Smith-Schuster level talents in free agency. So the free agency class this year isn't great, but Jacoby Myers, DJ Chark, I know those names aren't super inspiring. Like I get it, but a lot of people thought the same thing when the Chiefs signed Juju and Marquez Valdes-Scantling. They said, oh, all right, they're replacing Tyreek Hill with these guys. They have no shot. And then Mahomes established the chemistry with those guys. So if the Ravens want to do the whole like trade for an A.J. Brown type player, completely on board, 100%. I am with it. DeAndre Hopkins, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin are guys we've all talked about. There are a couple other options I've seen, like Adam Thielen, for example. I'm fine with that. Go for it. But if the Ravens want to take that Chiefs blueprint and say, hey, look, we have a lot of this homegrown talent. We have a couple of guys on the offensive line who we've signed and aren't our own. But again, talent is talent, whether it's homegrown, whether you bring guys in. But the Chiefs blueprint has been trading for guys at key holes. Remember, the Chiefs offensive line in that Tampa Bay Super Bowl when they lost was horrendous. And they went out and they completely revamped that line. They traded for Orlando Brown Jr. They drafted Creed Humphrey. They signed Joe Thuney. They went out there and they addressed their holes in such an incredible fashion. And then I think it all came together over those years. So if you're adapting the Kansas City blueprint in terms of roster building in particular, like you look at it, you have Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson, two extremely good quarterbacks. I mean, I give the edge to Mahomes, don't get me wrong, but still two very talented guys. In the run game, it's homegrown talent, but then you have like a veteran option. So for them, Jerick McKinnon was their veteran guy who they brought in. For the Ravens, you could call that Kenyon Drake. But the Ravens, the Chiefs drafted Isaiah Pacheco in the seventh round. The Ravens have J.K. Dobbins. They have Gus Edwards, who was an undrafted guy. Wide receiver wise is where the difference is, though. The Chiefs, I think, while they did draft players like Sky Moore and they have other draft picks on their roster that they have developed and are trying to develop, for the Ravens, they need to go and take that blueprint from either Philadelphia or Kansas City and say, we're going to trade for a number one, or we're going to sign a couple of pure borderline one, number two, maybe high-end wide receiver three options, more bordering on the look, if you can either trade for a wide receiver one or sign two wide receiver twos, like actual pure wide receiver twos. I'm not talking Michael Crabtree. I'm not talking Jeremy Maclin or Mike Wallace, although I loved Mike Wallace in Baltimore. I'm not going to lie. But regardless, you can't have those veteran retreads for a year. They have to be Steve Smith Sr. type impacts, Anquan Bolden type impacts, Derek Mason type impacts, not Des Bryant type impacts or Crabtree or Maclin. So it's actually kind of similar how the Ravens have built their roster compared to Kansas City, except now you have to deal with the question of Lamar Jackson. And I know a lot of people have talked about, well, the Ravens failed to maximize Lamar's rookie contract, where I think in Kansas City they did it decently well. They did it decently well over there in Kansas City, I'd say, with surrounding Mahomes with weapons, Philadelphia's. And, I don't think the Ravens did as good of a job as those teams like Kansas City and Philadelphia and Buffalo and Arizona and Cincinnati and all these different teams. They didn't do as good of a job as those teams as maximizing Lamar Jackson's rookie contract. Well, if they sign Lamar to an extension, they have an opportunity they have an opportunity to, I'd say, make up for some of those mistakes, because Lamar on the 5th-year option last year made upwards of $20 million. I believe the hit was around $22 million on the salary cap. As we've talked about it, and if you've heard me talk over these last couple of weeks here on the show, if the Ravens sign Lamar to a contract extension, they can make it backloaded, at least cap hit wise, and even money wise if they want to, where you can have that first year cap hit be 10 million. Maybe that second year cap hit is 18. And then you have a couple of years where potentially this extension could have a cap hit for Lamar be less than he played on last year on that 5th-year option, which then you can go out and trade for a number 1 or sign the 2 number 2s. But Kansas City has established a blueprint where they put it together. And then when you talk about the coaching aspect of things and how that offense is run there in Kansas City, it ties into our second segment, because the Ravens are reportedly going to talk to a couple of Super Bowl coaches after this game ended. And maybe it's today, maybe it's tomorrow. We don't know yet. But Eric Bieniemy of the Chiefs and Brian Johnson of the Eagles. So we're going to talk about those two guys. We talked about Bieniemy a lot, but Brian Johnson's the new name officially in this search. So be sure to stay tuned. Still a lot to talk about here on Locked On Ravens. But first, this episode is sponsored by BetterHelp. And when you're at your best, you can do a lot of great things, but it's not always that way. Sometimes life can get you bogged down and you may feel overwhelmed, or even like you're not showing up in the ways that you really want to. But working with a therapist can help you get closer to the best version of you, because when you feel empowered, you're more prepared to take on everything that life throws at you. And there are so many people that benefit from therapy, and there are so many positive experiences that come out of therapy, such as being able to learn positive coping skills. You can learn to set boundaries, and it even can empower you to become the best version of yourself. It isn't just for those who have experienced major trauma. There's a lot of different therapy out there that has helped a lot of different people. And if you're thinking of giving therapy a try, BetterHelp is a great option. It's convenient, it's flexible, it's affordable, and entirely online. You just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists anytime for no additional charge. If you want to live a more empowered life, therapy can get you there. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/lockedon. We return here, our second segment of Locked On Ravens. Kevin Oestreicher, your host, still here with you again. Thank you so much for tuning in with us today and making us your first listen on Locked On Ravens. Be sure again to like this video, subscribe to the channel on YouTube if you want more Daily Ravens content. Also, if you want more Daily Ravens content, be sure to follow along in audio form anywhere you get your podcast. And if you want daily NFL content, make your second listen Locked On NFL. I host a Monday show over there. So I talk with experts around our network about the biggest stories. So obviously we talk about the Chiefs and the Eagles, and even we talk about the Texans this week. So be sure to check that out and make that your second listen to see and hear more me if you want that type of thing. But let's now talk about the offensive coordinator search. We've talked about it a lot, but it feels like Baltimore was almost waiting for the Super Bowl to be over, because it seems like a couple of their top choices, or at least some of them, are from the 2 Super Bowl teams, and the Chiefs and the Eagles. And we talk about how can the Ravens kind of take the blueprint from Kansas City or even a Philadelphia. Well, maybe take one of their coaches and have a coach come be the offensive coordinator for this team. We've talked about Eric Bieniemy a ton. Now, Jeremy Fowler of ESPN put out a tweet on Sunday about a couple of these names, being Brian Johnson and Eric Bieniemy. And he said that the Ravens are expected to talk with Eagles quarterback coach Brian Johnson and Chiefs offensive coordinator Eric Bieniemy after the Super Bowl about their offensive coordinator job, per his sources. And we've kind of heard the rumblings about Bieniemy for a while now, about how he's a prime candidate for the Ravens offensive coordinator position and how he could be a fit there. And is he leaving Kansas City? Well, this report kind of, again, pushes that agenda, I would say, in the direction of maybe it does have a really realistic shot of happening here. I talked with one person who covers the Chiefs and is in tune with the Chiefs, and he doesn't expect Eric Bieniemy back in Kansas City in 2023. And again, that doesn't mean that he's not going to be. Like, obviously things change and things happen and nothing is confirmed until it's confirmed, but he's had a couple of one-year contracts, and this one-year contract is up. He just won another Super Bowl. So it depends on, I guess, what his goals are. And I talk about it with players. Every player has a different goal. Every player has different values. Some players want big paydays. Other players want to win. Other players want an opportunity where they're going to get a lot of stats and kind of pump up their stat sheet a little bit. So for coaches, it's the same thing. Eric Bieniemy is in a really good spot right now in Kansas City. I mean, he's the offensive coordinator of a team that has had historic offenses and has won multiple Super Bowl championships, has hosted 5 straight AFC championship games. Like, he's in a really good spot right now, but at the same time, I think he deserves a head coaching spot, and I think he's deserved it for a little bit now, and he's getting some consideration, but he's just not getting the final consideration, which I don't necessarily think is very fair. I think he does deserve that opportunity. But the question for Bieniemy and for a lot of people, I mean, I think there are multiple reasons maybe why these teams aren't giving him head coaching opportunities, but I think one of them is the fact that there are just questions about how much of the offense is actually Bieniemy's offense and how much of it comes down to Andy Reid and his play calling. Now, the thing that's been put out is that it's both of them. Like, they have multiple people who have input on the offense, who have input on the play calls. But Eric Bieniemy was given a shout out by Andy Reid after the Super Bowl, and Patrick Mahomes gave him a shout out as well. And it seems like, I'm not going to sit here and say Bieniemy's not a part of that offensive group. I mean, I think he's a big part of it. I think he's a very smart football mind. The Chiefs run that, Andy Reid West Coast offense where you get the timing routes, you can use motion, you scheme guys up really well, scheme guys open, and it works. We saw down in the red zone, the Chiefs had one of the best red zone offenses in the league this year. And I mean, it showed in the Super Bowl. They were scheming guys open and it was incredible. The Ravens had one of the worst red zone offenses in the league. Bieniemy would really, really help that. Now, I know there's been speculation of him potentially being linked to the Commanders, being linked to the Cardinals, even, having an outside shot at the Indianapolis Colts head coaching position. But I think Bieniemy would be a slam dunk hire. And I know that there are some out there, like some players just do not like Eric Bieniemy whatsoever. I think LaShawn McCoy is one of those players. Then you have the guys who do like Bieniemy. Like I know Jamal Charles had some good things to say about him. So again, I think every player responds differently to, different types of coaching. I think Bieniemy's style, it's been reported it can be, I guess, harsh. I don't know exactly what it is. And again, I'm not super privy to it. So that's just like what I've read a little bit. I'm not saying it's true or not. But he apparently also that gets the best out of a lot of the players he coaches. So it's a two-way street there. And I think Bieniemy would be a great hire for him. I mean, the Chiefs offense this year, just to read off actual pure stats, they were the 8th best rushing team in the NFL in terms of net yards per attempt, 4.7 yards per attempt. They were also the best passing team in the NFL, 7.5 yards per attempt through the air. And again, this is just something where he would be, I think, an upgrade from what you get in Greg Roman. I think the offense expands more, becomes more diverse, and I like that. And again, third down percentage, they were the second best in the NFL offensively. Fourth down, they were the second best offensively. Red zone, they were the second best offensively this year. So just some stats a little bit. But then we move on to Brian Johnson, the quarterback's coach over in Philadelphia right now. Look, Philadelphia had a great year offensively. We saw Jalen Hurts take a lot of strides under the tutelage of Brian Johnson. And Johnson has actually known Jalen Hurts since when he was a little kid. So they've been working together and they have a connection. Now, I think Johnson is a really good candidate for what the Ravens want to do. I mean, the Eagles offense, it is a ground first team, despite the stats I'm going to read off here in a second, which are actually very interesting. But there's not a ton of motion in their offense, but the RPO game for them, it puts defenders in limbo. And it's kind of like what we saw, in 2019, let's say, where you couldn't defend it in Baltimore because you didn't know where the ball is going. And it took extreme gap discipline by those guys. So the Eagles use Jalen Hurts as a runner a lot. I think Johnson would be able to take some of those concepts that Shane Steichen, who's the offensive coordinator there right now in Philadelphia, is implemented. And it's pretty much just reactionary for a defense. If you don't react the right way, you get gashed. And the way that the Eagles schemed guys open and schemed these reads up, it really, really helped. Plus, they have an aspect in their passing game, which is the air raid portion of the offense, which is deep shots, so you go everybody deep, verticals and whatnot. So you have to be able to respect the air raid aspect of the offense while also being so worried about what this team does on the ground. Now, Philadelphia as a team in 2022, they actually had, it's funny to read it out this way, but they had the third amount of attempts in the NFL with 544, but they only had the 13th best rushing offense with 4.6 yards per attempt. Now, passing wise, they only attempted the 23rd most attempts in the NFL at 536. So they actually ran the ball more than they passed it, 544 attempts on the ground to 536 attempts through the air. But they finished as the 4th best passing offense in the NFL with 7.1. So despite them running the ball more, it was the passing offense that actually was better for them, despite them actually running the ball more. So if you're the Ravens and you kind of want to keep with what you're doing a little bit while just adding more elements, I think Brian Johnson would be great. I think he'd be another slam dunk hire. Now, something that came up, and I say the Brian Johnson agenda for the Ravens was February 12th, 2023 to February 12th, 2023, because the report came out about the Ravens speaking to Johnson after the Super Bowl. And then a little bit after that, a report came out about Shane Steichen, who apparently, the Colts told all other candidates for the head coaching opportunity, you're not in the running anymore, and it's looking like Steichen's going to become the guy for them. So nothing official till it's official, but if Steichen is hired, the obvious, logical, and the believed choice would be for the Eagles just to promote Brian Johnson to their offensive coordinator spot, and that would be that. So it depends what happens with Steichen. I think if Steichen stays as the offensive coordinator in Philadelphia, there's a real shot that the Ravens have a shot at Brian Johnson. But if Steichen leaves for Indianapolis, then I'd probably say it's 90% likely that Brian Johnson becomes the offensive coordinator, and then you just cross that name off the list. So two very intriguing options. Honestly, my 1-2. I think my 1-2 in terms of candidates we've heard about and have been reported on, Eric Bieniemy, Brian Johnson, and then Todd Monken. I think Todd Monken is my number 3 guy, but for me, I think there's a little gap between Bieniemy, Johnson, and then what Monken can bring to the table. So names, and we'll see what ends up happening at the end of the day with those names and who ends up being the next guy for the Ravens. Coming up in our final segment, we'll talk about Calais Campbell and his decision to return, what it could mean for the Ravens, and if his year will even be in Baltimore next year. So be sure to stay tuned. Still lots to dive into on the show. But first, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel. And the midway point of the NBA season is here, and now is the perfect time to download FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because new customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000. That's bonus bets back if your first bet doesn't win. Just download the FanDuel Sportsbook app. It's safe and secure and super easy to use. Then you can bet on everything from the money line to point scores and threes drained. And for me, I'm a Denver Nuggets guy. I'm a big Denver Nuggets fan. And for me, the Nuggets play Miami tonight in Miami, and I know the saying Miami nightlife is undefeated, much like LA nightlife is undefeated. But if you want to bet against the Nuggets and bet on the Miami nightlife to make them lose tonight against Miami, you can bet that money line. But if you bet on the Nuggets, if you think the Nuggets can defeat both the Heat and Miami nightlife, I'm sure that money line might change a little bit over the course of these next couple of hours here. So if you still want to do that, FanDuel is the place for that. They have so many more exclusive bets like the 2x3, 2 3-pointers scored in the first 3 minutes. Plus, FanDuel even lets you combine your bets for a chance at a bigger payout with a same-game parlay. So don't miss this chance to get your no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 in bonus bets when you go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon to learn more. Make every moment more of FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. We are back here. It's our final segment of Locked On Ravens here on Monday. Kevin Oestreicher is still here with you, talking about the Ravens and everything relating to this team, as we do 5 days a week here on the show. But let's now dive into a bit of Calais Campbell, because the big news coming out on Super Bowl Sunday. Calais Campbell talked with Rich Eisen and the NFL Network crew and the game day crew over there and did a Super Bowl preview. It was about 3 hours, and he was giving his opinions, telling Eric DeCosta, let's get the deal on with Lamar. But then at the end of it, Rich Eisen just said, oh, and you're coming back for your 16th season. And Campbell says, yep, I'm coming back. I'm back, baby. And I'm like, oh, all right. That's like big news. And it is really big news. Campbell back for his 16th season. It kind of felt this way. It kind of felt like he was going to come back based off of what he said during his exit interviews and in his season interviews and everything like that. It felt like he thought there was unfinished business, at least just for him personally in his career, especially with his 100th sack. He finished the year only achieving 99 for his career. And to have 100 be such a big goal for him, he's talked about it for so long. Ever since he was a kid, he's wanted to get 100 sacks, and to come up one short. I mean, I think he's still playing at a high enough level where he can blow by that in just one more year and maybe even get to 110. Maybe he can be a double-digit sack guy. I think he played that well in 2022. But the question for Campbell is, look, I'm 100% like Calais Campbell. I think he's best in Baltimore. Like, I think that he would be such an asset to Baltimore's defense. And let me be clear, he's under contract for one more season, so he is still a Raven right now. But there's been plenty of speculation about where he's going to play in 2023, because we go to the Baltimore salary cap table and we look at the cap hits for 2023. for the Ravens. Campbell currently has a $9.4 million cap hit scheduled for 2023 with only $2.4 million in dead money. So the Ravens can save $7 million if they end up releasing Calais Campbell. Now, I am not endorsing that. I am not endorsing that move. I say have Calais Campbell stay in Baltimore, but I think a restructure. I think a restructure would be wise for the Ravens to at least approach Campbell about and see. And I think Campbell right now in his career, he's about winning. I think Campbell's about winning. I think he'd be open to the idea of a restructure to help the team out. I don't want to speak for him, but that's just my gut feeling. I think that Campbell would do that. He is a leader on the field. He is a leader off of the field. He's the perfect guy. And it feels like there are those players who like come to an organization and you say, wow, it really feels like this guy's been with this organization for his entire career. Calais Campbell, it honestly feels that way to me, or at least I wish that he was a Raven for his entire career because he embodies what a Raven is. And, from his leadership to mentorship skills, to just who he is as a person, he has a very kind heart. But on the field, he's just dominant. He leaves it all out there every single Sunday. He's the perfect guy you want in an organization. So while I do think the Ravens should at least attempt a restructure with Campbell, I'm not in favor. And it's the same thing with Kevin Zeitler, by the way. We'll talk about cap casualties in a future episode, probably either this week or next, or just coming up in the future. And we'll talk about both these guys. We'll talk about Calais Campbell and we'll talk about Kevin Zeitler as well. And my answer to both is going to be that they shouldn't move on from either of them, despite the savings. And I know for the Ravens last year, Tavon Young was a guy who I was like, you could move on from him, but he also provides some value. I think he was their best tackler in 2021 personally, but he was their only realistic guy that they could actually get rid of and save money. For the Ravens, there are a couple others. I mean, Chuck Clark, you can release and save about $4 million, just under $4 million. Pasher McCary saves you $2 million, but there aren't like a ton of players who you're looking at and you're saying, yeah, the actual on-field loss is worth the money. Because again, with every salary cap casualty or cut or whatever, you're going to have to refill that hole on the roster with somebody else. And if that player is not even like, if Calais Campbell's 10 times the replacement player, you're losing on-field value for maybe it's minimal cap saving. So something to keep in mind. Campbell's been dominant for so many years. Great as a run defender. He brings an interior pass rushing presence. He's great for a young defensive line with guys like Justin Madubuike and Broderick Washington and Travis Jones and some of those other players. But another aspect of this whole thing is what happens with Lamar Jackson could impact what happens with Calais Campbell. And even, we can loop Justin Houston back into this conversation. It's stuff I've talked about where, again, Calais Campbell at this point in his career, I believe, is all about winning. And I think Lamar Jackson, as I've talked about, gives the Ravens their best and most realistic shot to win right now. So if the Ravens trade away Lamar Jackson and go with a rookie or go with a bridge guy, that lowers the Ravens' chances of winning because the odds of hitting on a stud first-year rookie quarterback, I mean, there's a chance, but Lamar Jackson can be a franchise quarterback for you. He is a franchise quarterback, whether it is for the Ravens or somebody else. So if Lamar Jackson goes away and a rookie comes in, does Calais Campbell look at the situation and say, oh, yeah, this is still my best chance of winning? Or does he look at a Kansas City? Does he look at a Buffalo or a Philadelphia or a San Francisco and say, maybe I'll go here for my last year because I want to win and I want to have an established quarterback instead of a rookie one? So I don't know. I mean, I don't know what the answer would be for both of those guys, but I think it is worth having the conversation about because I think it's an interesting point to bring up and say, Lamar has an impact on a lot of things. So it's just, again, the wait and see game with Lamar. But for Calais Campbell, we do know he's back for his 16th season. And as of this moment, as we record here, he is still a Baltimore Raven. And I hope it stays that way. I really hope it stays that way for year 16 for him. That's all I have for you here today on Locked On Ravens. Thank you so much for being here and tuning in with us today. Again, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel on YouTube, follow along in audio form as well. 5 days a week here on Locked On Ravens, Monday through Friday, even in the offseason. We do not stop every week, Monday through Friday, 5 days a week. When we get back here tomorrow, it's more Ravens content from us, so be sure to stay tuned for that, and I'll see you right back here tomorrow.